Good afternoon. It's great to be here. As Susan said, the third attempt, so I am almost barely able to believe I'm actually standing here. But anyway, I'm delighted to talk to you at Yale about one of the great enthusiasms of my life recently. In fact, one might say it took over my life completely recently, which is the UCL Centre for Digital Humanities and how it's progressed. It is officially it is just over 3 years old now. It's probably coming up 4 years old in terms of its actual original conception. And so what I'm going to talk about today is really how it all came about, what we've learnt, and I hope that some of that at least will be of interest in terms of your thoughts about how digital humanities might progress at Yale. Okay, so every talk about digital humanities these days apparently seems to have to start with definitions. Generally, I don't like trying to define digital humanities. I take a Nike attitude to it, which is just do it. But nevertheless, I think that we need to think about what is UCL's view of digital humanities, and in some ways it is slightly different from other views of DH, partly, as I will argue, because of the way our centre came to be and some of what turn out to have been constraints, but also rather happenstance-led, useful constraints in many ways. We think of digital humanities as, okay, the application of digital or computational research to the arts and humanities. Yeah, so far, so uncontroversial. That's what most people think digital humanities is. We also like to include, and in fact think is absolutely essential to include, cultural heritage practice. So digital techniques in the museum sector, working with galleries. I was until recently the head of department chair for the Department of Information Studies at UCL. So I think very much in these terms about archives and libraries. So that is one thing that comes about because of, in a sense, my own disciplinary basis. I just happened to be in the Department of Information Studies, as did my colleague Melissa Terrace, and we'd been doing digital humanities for a long time before the actual centre was set up. So I think, in a sense, this is partly what drove the way we think about it. But I think it's also important to think about DH as the use of humanities methods to study the digital. So, as Susan told you, I'm interested in social media. Yes, as in how social media is used by museums, how social media is used as a serious research tool, but I'm also interested in it as a phenomenon, if you like, in questions of how do we construct our own identity in digital places, if you like. And I think, therefore, that is a question that humanists have been asking forever. How do we express ourselves? How do we construct our identities? How do we communicate with other people? What is it, if you like, to be human? And I think those questions of what is it to be human are just as relevant for a digital humanities as those questions of how do we apply digital techniques to humanities or cultural heritage research problems. We are a little bit different in the way we do digital humanities at UCL. I will shortly tell you the peculiar story of how it came about, but the result of all this is that we are very, very blessed to be able to communicate and collaborate with not only humanities scholars, but also our colleagues in engineering and computer science. And one of the things we realised very early was that the version of DH that we want to do is not about subordinating the computer guy to the humanities researcher. What we're trying to do is to create new knowledge and come up with meaningful research for both parts of the partnership, or even several parts of the partnership if you include cultural heritage as well. So the idea is that not only should the humanities scholar get some interesting research out of this and find, create new knowledge, but the engineer or the computer scientist should too. For example, there are numerous examples of this, but one of the examples that I like to talk about is the research of one of our engineering colleagues. Now, in the day job, as it were, he researches the use of complex materials, and one of the people he works with is NASA. But in the other part of his existence, he actually does 3D scanning of museum objects. We have a fantastic museum of Egyptian archaeology called the Petrie Museum, after Flinders Petrie, who founded it. And the problem about it is that, like everything at UCL, there isn't enough space. So a lot of their artifacts are actually packed away and you can't see them. Now, of course, if you 3D scan them, you're not actually necessarily, you're not seeing the same object. It is a digital representation of an object. It doesn't make up for the lack of the object, but it's better than not seeing it at all. And in doing so, we have not only found out a lot about digital representations of museum objects, so we've created some interesting research collaboratively with the museum sector, but Stuart has also, therefore, advanced his research into complex materials. So you're getting a serious piece of engineering research out of this, as well as the humanities research. That's not the only example, but that's one of them. And that, I think, is extremely important, and it is quite distinctive to the way we do DH at UCL. I think it's also relevant to this that we're the only, it depends which global rankings you read, but in general, UCL is roundabout up there in the kind of top 10. And we're the only university in that kind of area that has an iSchool, which is important because iSchools, or Departments of Information Studies as we call them, are very into collaborating. We tend to have members of staff who were information professionals, who have been practicing archivists, publishers, librarians. They understand the importance of collaborating with other disciplines. They don't always work in a single scholar paradigm. And that's extremely important because to do DH effectively, in most cases, it is important to collaborate. And this is not something that humanities scholars are always happy about doing. So one of the things that having an iSchool does is it gives you as it were, a collaboration platform, which is, not always present. The other thing that we have, which of course you do at Yale as well, is really world-class museums, art galleries, special collections, and that again is very important, and I think that's driven our kind of attitude to DH research, because people in the museums and special collections are very interested in things digital, and actually were some of the first people that said, that's great, let's collaborate. As I say, our engineering colleague 3D scanning museum objects. And that, I think, came as much from the museum side as that came from the engineering side. So I think all of these factors are, give us our distinctive way of doing DH, if you like. But what do we actually do? How do we do DH? Well, one of the things that I realized very early when we started UCLDH is that I could not really use the same model as some of the, what I'd call first phase digital humanities centres, such as our colleagues at King's College London, who've had a centre for digital humanities for many years. When they started up, as it were in the Paleolithic era from digital terms, there were so few people doing digital humanities that if scholars wanted access to digital resources or the computing power necessary to do what they wanted, they really had to go to a centre where they could work with technical people and get have enough computing capacity. Now, what I realised when we began UCLDH is we couldn't do that. There were clearly people all over the university, and literally all over the university, who were doing things that we might now call digital humanities. Whether they were actually calling them digital humanities at the time is another question. And so it was very clear that we couldn't have this kind of idea of everybody must come to us, everybody must come to a physical centre if they wanted, and that we were sort of gatekeepers to DH. We couldn't do that. So there had to be another model, and that model was, in a sense, that of a network. So we began by saying, well, let's find out what is there out there, who's doing what, and connecting people. So I was saying at the workshop this morning, my then department chair was horrified when I said that we were going to do this, because he said, well, this is terrible, you'll stop doing your own work and help other people. And actually, he was right in many ways, but it's been a very interesting experience to do so. But the point about it is that we're there not to tell people how they should do digital humanities or whether they should do digital humanities, but try and put different people together. So, a lot of what we've been doing is someone will come with an idea or a potential project and say, does this make sense to you? And actually, do you know anybody else who is interested in this? Or is there someone else I should talk to? And then a lot of what we're doing is saying, great, yes, you should talk to that person, or you should talk to so-and-so. And therefore, a lot of what we've been doing is this kind of brokerage role of creating a network, of linking people, of having people actually working on similar things and who simply did not know that somebody else existed who was interested in that type of area. And that means making connections not just in the university, but outside the university. With cultural heritage organisations outside universities, sometimes with commercial companies. And that is very sort of central to what we feel we do. So, yes, we are a centre, but I think of us in a kind of hypertext theory way of being the hub of a network. We're not really just the sort of centre that sucks things in. And what we try and do, as I say, I am not the kind of person that tries to define what people should be doing in digital humanities. I tend to feel that if people think they're doing digital humanities, they probably are. And therefore, we try and be as inclusive as possible, and we try not to say, yes, we'll work with this person, no, we can't work with that person. We try and find some connections and some people who will work together, even if it's not something we are personally expert in. As I've said, it's very important that we do have these links with cultural heritage. And this is not only our museums and collections, it's also practicing artists. We have a fantastic group of digital artists at the Slade School of Art, which is, of course, world-renowned art school. And it's very interesting to have conversations with them about making digital work, about how digital work is preserved. But also our position in London is great because it means we are literally physically right in the middle of huge numbers of museums, galleries, publishers, libraries, you name it. So we've got, currently we are collaborating with the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the National Gallery, the British Library, the National Archives. It just happens, really. It just so happens that where we are, it's ironic when you're considering that we are a digital entity. We don't have a physical centre, but where we physically are does drive the way we work because we are, we have those connections so easily to the cultural heritage sector. Also, how do we foster this network? How do we make these connections work? Well, we've done quite a lot of things that are specifically aimed at networking. So we have things called digital excursions where we visit parts of the university or parts of the world outside the university where interesting digital things are going on. So we might go to the cave in computer science. There was just an excursion that I've not been able to get to because I'm here, looking at the University of London data centre and how they actually, how the vast amounts of computing power actually look when you physically see them. We've been to the British Museum, we've been to the British Library for various sort of digital exhibitions. And the idea of these is not so much pedagogical, but to foster networking. So the idea is that people might be interested to see what's going on digitally, but the talk is always very short. And the networking activity, which is importantly wine and, everybody seems to think this is terribly quaint, nibbles. Apparently people don't use the word nibbles, but what I mean by that is, little canapes and stuff like that you give people, and the idea is we just get people talking, and it's through those connections that people make that often, new activities are spun off. This just came about by accident when we had the internal launch event, and one of the professors from the English faculty said, this is great, we should have more reasons why we can just get together and have a free glass of wine. And I thought, right, that's it. Then digital excursions happened. We have things that are more pedagogical called painless introductions, where we give short talks at lunchtime on kind of digital techniques and that kind of fairly low-level stuff, intended for people like graduate students, but we get some faculty members at those as well. We have a graduate student-led group called Decoding Digital Humanities, which came up really rather by accident, with some graduate students who said they would just like to put together a reading group about, kind of seminal texts in digital humanities, if you like. And that, has been very interesting. We have invited speakers. We kind of grab people when they happen to be in London and say, will you please come and give a talk to our students? We also have quite a lot of social media profile, which I'll talk about on its own. So we tweet, we blog, we do podcasting. Of course, we do research. So we have funded research projects. We also teach. We have the only dual designation digital humanities course in the world, as far as I know, which can be an MA or an MSc, depending on how technical or not the students decide to make their course, because there's a lot of optional content. And we help sponsor some digital groups such as Digital Classicists. As I say, one of the things that's terribly important about UCLDH is we do good parties. Parties turn out to be very, very useful for creating new research in digital humanities. So, we steal ourselves and make ourselves give parties on a regular basis, so that people can come along and find out what we do. But we also do go out and take part in more directed, shall we say, public engagement activities. So we will run joint workshops with the British Museum, for example. And all of these really are activities that are, how shall I put it, really about profile raising. Nobody knew we existed. Before we started the centre, really nobody knew what it was I did, even my own colleagues, except for one of them. And then nobody knew what she did either. But the thing is that therefore we had to create a sense of, people need to know who we are, people need to know what we do. So we needed to do as many things as we possibly could, so that people would find out what it is we did. And here comes the money bit. How did we come into being? Well, this is where I tell the strange story of how UCLDH happened. In many ways, it was a concatenation of luck and just things happening at the university level, which we were able to ride on the back of. This thing called the Provost Strategic Development Fund was created, which is an idea of having a kind of central fund which was intended to fund startup activities for a couple of years, with the idea that it was a sort of almost an experiment to see if things would be able to make themselves sustainable. So we had 2 years of funding from Provost Strategic Development Fund, and the idea was then we had to be able to run ourselves financially after 2 years. The reason why it's a curious story is just that everything seemed to come together at once, and it was simply because of a kind of a lucky email that one dean sent to another dean. And in fact, no, it was the who has become the Dean of Engineering, but at the time he was head of computer science. And he heard one of my colleagues, Willan McCarty, give a talk about digital humanities in Cambridge, and emailed the dean, and I happened to be acting associate dean at the time, and he just sent this email saying, I've heard this talk about this thing called digital humanities, we should do that here. And it only came to me because I was associate dean, not because I was doing anything to do with digital humanities. And I said, well, that's funny, I do digital humanities. And he said, oh, well, that's great, we should talk. And from that, everything began. And we held a town meeting in a lecture hall, something like this, and slightly bigger, and I hoped that we'd have more than 2 or 3 people in it. And we just had a little meeting about what we did, and a few people talked about their work. And there came to it over 100 people from every part of UCL, from every faculty. And it was at that point I thought, okay, we're onto something here. I don't know how this is going to work, but it's going to work. And at that point, we then put together the Vice Provost Research came up to me at the beginning of that, just as I was about to give the talk to start off the meeting. And he said, and what do you want out of this meeting? And I thought, at the time, I actually don't know what I want, but I thought that's probably not what I say to the Vice Provost Research. So I said, I think I might want a Centre for Digital Humanities. And he said, that sounds good, come and see me, I'll help you write the bid. And that was it. So, as I say, in a sense, a kind of happenstance, a sort of lucky time. But we did have to make this money work for us. So in 2011, we launched the MA-MSc, and really because teaching income is more reliable than research income. We do research, of course, but it's not a reliable source of income. And it was also very important that, as I say, we did have this buy-in from senior management. The Provost obviously funded it from his development fund. The Vice Provost Research was interested in what we were doing. The deans of both the faculties of engineering and arts and humanities were enthusiastic because the dean of engineering, or the soon-to-be dean of engineering, has an MA in art as well as being a computer scientist. And the dean of arts and humanities, as was a book scholar, but also happened to do some digital humanities himself. So while he was not a techie exactly, he got it. He understood the reason for it. So we've had a kind of very important support from senior management, and I think that's been absolutely crucial. I don't think this thing can be done without the buy-in from people who, put crudely, control the finances. What's the focus of what we do? I mean, again, this is partly driven by where we were and what we were. We've always had a particular interest in studying users of digital humanities, or digital resources in the humanities and in cultural heritage, partly because that's what I happen to do, but it's also particularly relevant in terms of suddenly people got interested in this because of things like the rise of e-readers, tablets, social media happened, and suddenly this whole idea of what are people doing with this digital stuff became particularly relevant. As I've said, this collaboration with cultural heritage builds on some of the strength that we already had, particularly in engineering. Also, in the engineering faculty, there was 3D scanning, but also my colleague, Melissa Terrace, and my other colleagues, Tim Vairish in computer science, had already serious expertise and interest in image processing, in working with digital images, in using digital images to foster research, particularly in the study of ancient documents and in archaeology. And, we've just got interested in this whole social media thing. I've been interested in social media ever since social media was called virtual communities. And there is kind of a difference, and there's a history in this, and I've been doing that for ages. So that is what I mean about applying humanities methods to the digital. I think studying social media is digital humanities because it's thinking about, how are we, what are we, how do we express ourselves in that particular way? How is it to be human in digital space? So you talked about, things we do. What the research we do is how we've made ourselves a master's course. But what is it that makes us different from other digital humanities centres? Well, one of the things is we don't do service computing. This came about really rather by accident, but that service in terms of helping support people with their computing activities and problems is actually very important, but it costs money. And it was very clear that the pump priming funds that we had were going to be pretty small, and it would buy some time buyout and some admin support, and that was going to be it. And the idea was that we would create income. And the way to create income is through research and teaching. It is not through doing support. So we don't do support. We might like to do that in the future if we, acquire some more money, but the point is we don't do that. Now, what I hadn't really realised in doing that, and I subsequently have realised, is that that gives us a different profile. It's not people thinking, oh, these are people in the computing services or something, aren't they? They think of us as faculty members who happen to do this thing called digital humanities. And it's also meant that we have collaborated a lot with our computer scientist colleagues, which is relatively rare. Digital humanities is often something that exists way outside computer science. And we've collaborated with people like our colleagues' master's students, because they need projects and we need some people to produce stuff because we don't have support folks. So that's actually produced some really good results because it's getting students involved, and we now get our own students involved in doing project work. I think also that a lot of previous digital humanities centres have rather grown up on a sort of they just happened basis. I know that the centre at King's grew out of being part of the computing services. And we are slightly different in that we were founded in this sort of particular way at this particular moment. And so we've had to adapt to our circumstances, as I say. This is the reason why we don't do service computing. This is the reason why we, because the Dean of Engineering was involved, we collaborate very much with computer science in the way that other people don't. Because we don't have a physical space, we do a lot of networking activities. And actually those constraints have ended up being strengths. And so we sort of created our own model for DH, thinking, well, here we have some established activities already. Here we have people doing this research. How can we best make these connections work? We also take digital identity very, very seriously. We tweet a lot, we blog, we have a website, but we did a huge amount of work on the website to create a look. This beautiful logo that you saw at the beginning of my talk was created by one of our PhD students, oddly, who's now actually become a professional designer, having finished his PhD. And he just has this talent for producing fantastic visual identity work. And that logo has literally gone around the world. People just recognize it. It just does express what we are. And, had it not been for having this incredibly talented PhD student, we probably wouldn't have had a logo in the first place because we wouldn't have had the money to pay for one. These are sort of peculiar happenstances, but once we have that, we do take it very seriously, and we do try and be very conscious about what we're doing in digital space as well, what that says about us. This is some of this has been remarkably successful. So, for example, we created, Melissa created at the beginning, some ideas of having some little posters with some images on or some kind of thought-provoking text on that we would just literally print out and stick up around UCL to just create some sort of, I wonder what that is, and with our website URL, and come and find out more. Curiously, we were never really able to do much of that at UCL because the provost objects to posters being stuck up around places. So actually that didn't really work in physical space, but where it did work was that Melissa put some of these up on her blog, and people saw them and said, these are fantastic, these are really great. Could we have some? So she made the high-resolution digital images available, and these have now gone to the NEH Office of Digital Humanities. So they're in Washington, D.C., some of our posters, and other universities that do DH have also printed up some of our posters. And so, that was never meant to happen, but they're very attractive posters, and they express some interesting ideas. And it's the kind of thing that other people who do DH want to show people. And so that, that's just been a matter of very good design, lovely logo, and other people want to get involved. The other thing that you're probably gathering is that we work very extensively with people outside academia. I think partly because of our interest in studying how people use digital resources, but then working with museums and cultural heritage. We see it as very important that digital humanities is not simply a field that speaks only to other academics, that it needs to speak to people in the cultural heritage sector and equally those people who use cultural heritage resources, so visitors to museums, users of libraries, those kind of things. This fits, again, very well with UCL's emphasis on public engagement, on the public understanding of science or humanities. As I said, I think this is it, what we've done is it's important that it does fit in with what UCL sees as important. Just one of the reasons why the Vice Provost Research was enthusiastic about digital humanities was that he had recently launched what are called the Grand Challenges, these being big research areas with the idea that scholars from all sorts of different areas might get involved in questions about global health or sustainable cities, intercultural interaction, and human well-being. And it's not always easy to involve humanities scholars in this because many humanities scholars prefer to do single scholar research. I think it could be seen that digital humanities was going to offer collaboration and the potential of collaboration. So this fitted very well with this kind of institutional priority as was then just being developed. Because we wanted to do interdisciplinary things. We didn't have to be forced, we actually enjoy it. This is not always the case with all humanities scholars. As I've said, we've got the support of our senior management, which is very, very important. And also that we, both the directors of museums and collections and of library services are very interested in what we do and get digital humanities. And I think that's been terribly important for the way that our collaboration has developed. Oddly, the other stuff I do in my life turns out to have been quite useful. So I told you the story about hearing about digital humanities just because I was acting as what we call Vice Dean, but you would call Associate Dean, I think, for research at the time. I then really wasn't in the plan at all, but just happened to become department chair of my department. And this has given me a sort of sense of, I've got insight into the way that the institutional strategy goes and the way that the institutional strategy is developing because of doing my, what I think you would call service roles. And this turns out to have been very useful because it's, you know, what we had to do, as I've said, was make ourselves indispensable. My thought was when we began this period with the pump priming money, we have to be so indispensable that people could not imagine UCL without UCLDH when we came to the end of the funding period. And I think that's now true, oddly enough. But it meant we had to work out what the university thought of as important and be part of it, whatever it was. This was very hard work. But nevertheless, it was therefore very useful to have this insight into the way the institution works, the way the institution wants to work. So what have we learned as a result of this? I think it's terribly important that digital humanities, as I say, I wanted it to be so embedded in the fabric of UCL that to unpick it would have been unthinkable. And that we have done. So therefore we need to be at the centre of everything. If there was a new initiative, we wanted to be part of it. If people said, will you do such and such, we said yes. We didn't, we're not these odd geeks who do stuff with technology. We are what we are, and we're part of, we're part of the centre of what's going on at the university. It was clear, therefore, that people needed to understand what it was we did. People still kind of say, what is digital humanities? My current dean is forever saying, what is digital humanities? And I say, you must be the only person in the university that doesn't know yet. But seriously, we worked very, very hard at the publicity. We worked very, very hard at, as I've said, blogging, tweeting, putting up posters, doing these networking events, just to kind of keep our profile really high, because we had to have this sense of proving our worth. If we didn't prove our worth, if we didn't make the money work, but also make the intellectual case for being important to the institution, that was it, end of centre after 2 years. And therefore I think, as I've said, what we needed to do was not only to take from the universities, but to give, to see how we could benefit other parts of the university. So my new job, which I'm being seconded to this year, is to, as you've seen, to be Deputy Director of a big doctoral training centre, which is a collaboration between ourselves, King's, and the School of Advanced Study, which is part of the University of London. And one of the things, when we were writing that bid, this is a multi-million-pound venture, to fund all studentships in the arts and humanities. So anybody who gets funded in the arts and humanities at these three universities to do a PhD student is being funded by this body. And one of the things we said in the bid was, we are distinctive because we will offer training to all the graduate students in digital humanities. I mean, every graduate student will have training in digital humanities. That's something that made us really distinctive, and that's something that our main rivals, being Oxford and Cambridge, couldn't offer, because they don't have some very, very good digital humanities projects, but they don't have the kind of central infrastructure, and they don't have the teaching infrastructure. to offer that kind of thing. So again, you can see what we were doing there was being useful, being helpful to that bid, and by all accounts, it really did help the bid get funded, and it's the second largest amount of money of all of the consortia that were funded. So, somebody liked it. As I said, we've also worked very hard at reaching out beyond academia. This again works with UCL strategy because we have done a lot of work on public engagement. I know public humanities, public scholarship is a very important and well understood thing in the US. It hasn't been in the UK, and it's something that's relatively recently being developed, and UCL takes this stuff extremely seriously. So our idea was to take part in public engagement and to take DH outside academia. The Curator project, for example, is a project using static iPads and creating interactive labels, so that instead of people being told, there are traditional labels as well, which tell you this is an aardvark, our interactive labels will pose questions to the visitor to say, do you think it is reasonable to display human remains in a museum? And people actually then the visitors want to engage in a dialogue with that. They want to answer questions, they want to give their views, they want to tell us what they like about the museum, which is not what we expected. But having done a study on that, one of the PhD students whose initiative it was that Curator came about, has proved that people really do want to do this, and that if trusted, they will actually write perfectly reasonable comments. So working with the public has been a massive opportunity for us, and particularly things using crowdsourcing, Web 2.0, social media to allow this sort of two-way dialogue. The Transcribe Bentham project is a very well-known project now, which applies crowdsourcing techniques to the corpus of Jeremy Bentham's work. And it's amazing, really. When it began, I had no idea that there would be so many people out there in the rest of the world who would enjoy transcribing Bentham's handwriting, because it's actually not easy. But it turns out that they do, and they love it, and there are thousands of people who've transcribed some of Bentham. And this is actually amazing, and it's remarkably transformative, because what it's doing is allowing anyone out there on the internet to be part of the scholarly process in a way that is, normally these sort of documents would only have been available to historians, perhaps to philosophers, but basically to scholars or to special collections librarians or archivists. Nobody else would have seen these things. And this really changes the way that we can think about involving the rest of the world in the scholarly process. And it's amazing how much people want to do it. So what we're doing is kind of raising awareness of what we're doing, but always doing high-quality scholarship. It's very important that what we're doing is good, and it's interesting, and it's well-produced in digital terms, but its scholarship is very sound too. And that we take very seriously, because that is what will make people use these things. So, are we indispensable? Yes, I hope we are. Nobody is absolutely indispensable, but I think we have embedded ourselves so much into UCL life that I think people would find it difficult. And people have said to me, and I think this is great, that they've actually said, God, I can't imagine digital humanities, not being at UCL anymore. It's, it is there. It's one of the globally most recognised digital humanities centres, not even according to us. That's what the Bibliothèque Nationale said about us. And it's just, it's one of the things that UCL is known for now. We've still got some things that we want to do. We have some fantastic students from the US, we have some fantastic master students from the EU and the rest of the world, but we have very few UK students. It's very odd that students in the UK almost seem to not know we exist. So we're going to try and work out how are we going to communicate to undergraduates that they might want to do master's work in digital humanities. Equally, we need to think about, well, are we going to have some undergraduate programs in digital humanities? How are we going to make that work? And in a sense, how are we going to create the capacity to expand? Because the irony of all this is we've worked so hard at it, and we've got so, popular, if you like, that we are literally at capacity. None of us has any more capacity to take on anything else. You know, we've all got as many PhD students as we can take. We're doing all the teaching we can do. We're doing all the research we can do. And there's nothing else we can do with the present levels of staffing. So we've got to think about how are we going to get resources to get more staffing in, because otherwise our very success is going to be a problem for us. We have to think about how to fund PhD students. As I say, I'm the deputy director of this new initiative, but even then, the money is short for funding PhD students. So we want to think, how are we going to create the next digital humanities generation of scholars, and where are we going to get that money from? We also have to be adaptable to the way things change. We have been adaptable to change in the way that we've set up, but we have to be adaptable in future. So some digital humanities centres get very bound up with the person who founded them. And when that person leaves, then the digital humanities centre can wobble a bit, or just, I mean, in some instances, just cease to exist. Now, it was an accident that I ended up being department chair. It was not something I had planned for, and I didn't mean to give up being director. I became co-director of digital humanities when I became department chair, and then gradually it became clear that it really needed a full-time director, and that was not going to be me, because I was doing too many other things. But I think in a funny way that's a good thing. Again, it's a constraint, but it's a good thing, because it means that we've had to deal with the idea of, okay, now who takes this on? And Melissa is now director and is taking the centre in, you know, fantastic directions, and it's more and more vibrant, and it's doing great new things, and there, you know, it's taken it again to a higher level, very far from being, you know, bound into the person that was the first director. So I think that's very important. We need to have the ability to change and adapt. We need some of our activities that we do now, you know, if they don't turn out to be appropriate in future, well, we won't do them. And some of the activities, for example, the graduate student-led reading group, depend on the enthusiasm of various different graduate students. Some are more enthusiastic than others, so sometimes we go through cycles of, you know, positive and, you know, lots of activity, and sometimes slightly less activity, and that's the sort of the adapting to change that I think we still need to do. And I think it's something that, you know, we don't want to get kind of tied into a particular way of doing things. So I think those are things that we need to look at for the future. But I think, yes, as I say, perhaps not absolutely indispensable, but I hope that we're there to stay. Thank you very much.